want to talk about the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is basically how we take oxygen from the atmosphere into our body cells and tissues, and how we get rid of our waste product, carbon dioxide. So the respiratory system works hand in hand with the actual cardiovascular system, which also is how we transport oxygen around our system. So these two systems work closely together. So the main function of the respiratory system is to permit gas exchange. That's the exchange of the two main gases we're talking about here, is oxygen and carbon dioxide, between the atmosphere and the bloodstream, so that all our metabolically active cells can be supplied with the oxygen that they need and get rid of their main waste product, in this case carbon dioxide. So when we talk about respiration, there's two main processes. There's external respiration and internal respiration. The action of actually breathing in and out, you'll also hear that referred to as ventilation. But in this case, external respiration, we're talking about breathing air in and out of the lungs, also referred to as ventilation, and exchange of gases. So oxygen we're breathing in from the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide we're breathing out of our lungs from our waste product due to the action of our metabolically active cells. And internal respiration, we're exchanging gases between the blood and our cells, our tissues and cells. And then the oxygen can then be used for cellular respiration. So in each case, oxygen and carbon dioxide will move by diffusion from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So there's two main things that I just want to get straight before we move on. So cellular respiration is basically how we break down our energy, our glucose, like from the food that we've eaten, how we create energy from the breakdown of glucose. And then diffusion is a sort of type of transport of how molecules move. So I'm just going to share the whiteboard with you, if I can just make sure that I've got the right screen on. So I'm just going to share the actual whiteboard. Hopefully you can see that now. And I just want to talk about cellular respiration first. So we've got, maybe you'll remember the word equation from high school, but we've got glucose, which we've taken in from the food we eat, plus in the presence of oxygen, produces the waste product carbon dioxide. Plus water plus energy. So that is the word equation for how we break down glucose in the presence of oxygen, which we refer to as aerobic respiration. And then we produce this waste product, this carbon dioxide. So sometimes you'll see oxygen, the symbol O2, and then CO2 for carbon dioxide, H2O for water, and the energy is in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, a molecule. So you might see it written out in full words, or you might see it written out in symbols. But basically, cellular respiration is this: when we've taken in food, we're breaking it down in the presence of oxygen, and we're producing the waste product carbon dioxide plus water plus our ATP, which is the energy currency of all our cells. So this process is happening all the time in our bodies, and it's essential for life, really. When I'm talking about diffusion, there's three main ways that molecules are sort of transported around the body. So we've got active transport, we have osmosis, and we have diffusion. This is the one we're interested in here, this last one. So active transport is usually where we require energy in the form of ATP to move molecules against their concentration gradient. So what is a concentration gradient? Basically, wherever there are two separate areas with differences in concentration. So wherever a difference in concentration exists between two areas, that's a concentration gradient. So in active transport, you're moving molecules against their concentration gradient from low to high. All molecules want to move naturally from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration to sort of balance out the molecules and make sure that they're even on both sides. So I always think of maybe if you imagine a glass of orange juice. This is a glass of orange juice, and so you've got it's a concentrated orange juice where you have to add the water. So if I put the concentrated orange juice in the bottom of the glass and then I add water into here, I was hoping that that would be blue. If I add water in, then basically eventually all the water and the orange juice is going to balance out, so it kind of looks all even. All the orange juice molecules and all the water molecules will balance out because the high concentration, which was in the bottom of the glass, will want to move to an area of low concentration of the orange juice concentrate. So eventually it'll balance out. But this can be anywhere. In the case that we're talking about diffusion, osmosis, or movement across membranes. So think about capillary membranes and cellular membranes, things like that. So active transport, you're moving against the concentration gradient, whereas osmosis and diffusion, we're always moving naturally from an area of high concentration to low concentration down a concentration gradient. If I just take this away, imagine this was a membrane, so a cell membrane of some sort, and say we have, I don't know, this could be, I'll just do the water molecule. These can be water molecules here on this side of the membrane, but then on this right-hand side of the membrane, we only have a few water molecules. So when we're talking about water specifically, this is osmosis. So the movement of water molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration down a concentration gradient. So there's a higher concentration of water on this left-hand side here. So molecules will naturally want to move to where there is a lower concentration of water and eventually equalize, balance out, create equilibrium. So when we are talking about the movement of water molecules, we're talking about osmosis. If we're talking about the movement of any other molecule, we can use the word diffusion. So small molecules like glucose, and in this case, we're talking about carbon dioxide and oxygen, so gas molecules. So gas molecules will naturally want to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration down a concentration gradient. And so you can think about the oxygen in terms of concentration. They usually call it partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide when we're talking about gases, but just think of it as concentration. So say, forget these being water molecules, say these are now oxygen molecules over here. Say they're in the lungs, and we want to get all that oxygen into the tissues. So there's a higher concentration in the lungs. You'll see as we go through this PowerPoint, you breathe in oxygen from the atmosphere down into the alveoli of the lungs, and then you want to move that oxygen to where there's a lower concentration inside the body cells. So the oxygen will naturally move into the capillaries surrounding the lungs and eventually into the body cells and tissues. So it's naturally moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration down the concentration gradient. So hopefully that has made sense there. Let's just go back to the PowerPoint now. If I make that large. So we'll look at the components of the respiratory system, and then I'll go back to diffusion and movement of gas molecules as we go through this PowerPoint. So the upper respiratory system consists of our nose and our pharynx, the back of the throat, and our larynx, where our voice box leads into the lower part of the respiratory system. So the upper part our nasal passages consist of sort of cilia and epithelial cells, which contain sort of, there's mucus in there, the hairs in our nose and the membranes within our nose kind of warm and filter the air as we're breathing that air in. And the air will travel down our sort of nasal passages, down into the pharynx, the throat, and then lead on into the lower part of the respiratory system. So our larynx is just at the top of the trachea. It's where the voice box is, or where our vocal cords are. So how we create sound, using sort of the vibrations of the air will create sound with our vocal cords. Then we've got the trachea, which is also referred to as the windpipe. So the trachea is this big long tube which runs parallel with the esophagus. But in this case, the trachea has these sort of rings of cartilage around them. So they're incomplete rings of cartilage to help keep the trachea or the windpipe open so that it doesn't just collapse in on itself. Down underneath the trachea, so sort of branching and dividing into two main branches, we've got the bronchi leading into the left and right lung, and then smaller and smaller divisions called bronchioles, which lead eventually right down at the very bottom of the lungs to the alveoli. So it'll be better if we actually see a diagram of this. So here is the larynx, or the voice box, just sitting at the top of the trachea. You can see the trachea with the rings of cartilage around it. So if you imagine a sort of horseshoe-shaped ring of cartilage, it's not a complete ring, it's a sort of horseshoe-shaped ring of cartilage with the open end towards the back where the esophagus is, so that when we are swallowing food down the esophagus, there's enough room for the bolus, what we call the food that we've just sort of made easier to swallow. That food, or that bolus, will be able to sort of bulge out a wee bit into the trachea without causing pain. If it was a complete ring of cartilage, it would actually be painful as you're trying to swallow food down the esophagus, which is running parallel. So it gives room for food to pass down the esophagus with these incomplete rings of cartilage, helping to keep the windpipe or the trachea open. And then we're leading down, so from the trachea you can see that it divides into two here. We've got these two branches called the bronchi, if we're talking about both of them, or bronchus, if we're talking about just one. It kind of looks like an upside down tree. The trachea would be the tree trunk, and then leading into the branches and leaves and everything. So we lead out into the left and right bronchi, and then into smaller and smaller, narrower divisions of the bronchi, which we call bronchioles. And right down at the very bottom of the bronchioles is where the alveoli are. So this is the most important bit that we're going to be looking at in terms of gas exchange. So this is where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. There's no gas exchange taking place from the larynx or the trachea and the bronchioles. It's all the gas exchange is occurring in the alveoli at the very bottom of the bronchial branches. So we also have at the top, you can't really see it here, but just because it's important to mention when we're thinking about the trachea and the esophagus running parallel to each other, the trachea actually has this little flap of cartilage which blocks off the windpipe when we do swallow food, and that ensures that any food goes down the esophagus and not the trachea. So we don't want food in the trachea. It's a closed system once food's in there. If food does accidentally get inside the trachea, we will naturally cough it up and out of the lungs. So there's a little flap of cartilage known as the epiglottis, which tries to protect the trachea from any food that might enter it. What else have we got? We've also got pleural membranes surrounding the lungs, which contain a sort of pleural fluid to help lubricate the lungs and help ventilation be easier and more smooth running. We have intercostal muscles between the ribs here, so the dark little shades here are the intercostal muscles, and then we have the white little shades are our ribs. So our ribs are obviously protecting the lungs because they're soft, squishy sort of lungs. We've got the right hand side of the lungs, so the right lung, I should say, has 3 lobes and the left-hand side has only 2 lobes. We also have this big sheet of muscle which separates the abdominal cavity from the thorax. It's called the diaphragm. It's a sort of dome-shaped sheet of muscle, and this contracts and relaxes in response to inhalation and exhalation. Here's a more coloured diagram. So we've got the nasal cavity. We breathe in air from the atmosphere down into the pharynx and larynx, down into the esophagus. We then down into the bronchioles, into the alveoli, and so forth. So the alveoli that I keep talking about is right down at the bottom of the lungs. They look like little air-filled sacs. Some people describe them as tiny little balloons. Some people describe them as bunches of grapes. They kind of look like bunches of grapes together. But they're little air-filled sacs right at the very bottom of the bronchioles, and they're surrounded by a rich network of blood capillaries. It's here, like I said, where the gas exchange occurs. All the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs at the alveolar capillary membrane. We'll look at that as we go further on. So it's important to note that most of the respiratory tract, from the nasal passages all the way down the trachea, most of the respiratory tract is lined with ciliated epithelial cells and goblet cells. So we've got columnar-shaped epithelial cells. They're kind of shaped like these rectangular columns. So we've got a picture above and below. So these rectangular shaped columns, the black little shade bit is just the nucleus of the cell. You can see at the top here, the surface bit. This is the bit where air would be passing, where these little cilia are, these little brush borders that you see at the top diagram. You can see it in more colour. They basically act like little sweeping brushes. So the cilia sort of sweep any dirt, any trapped dirt up and away from the lungs, and the goblet cells in between the ciliated epithelial cells, they secrete mucus. They're named goblet cells because they're shaped like a goblet wine glass, and they secrete mucus. So the mucus helps trap any dirt and debris or whatever that we might have breathed in, and the cilia help move that mucus like little sweeping brushes up and away from the lungs. So we'll either spit out phlegm and try and get rid of any sort of dirt or microbes or debris that we might have breathed in that way, or you can swallow it and your digestive system would deal with it. So we've got both ciliated epithelium with a little acting like little sweeping brushes, and goblet cells which secrete that mucus to trap any dirt or debris, microbes and things that we might breathe in. And that's why it's healthier, obviously, in our nasal passages as well. We've got the cilia and the mucus to help sort of trap any dirt and bacteria and things that we might breathe in. So that's why it's healthier to breathe in through your nasal passages than it is to breathe in through the mouth, because we don't have that same protection in the mouth. So breathing in, also referred to as inhalation or inspiration. When we breathe in, the external intercostal muscles contract. That's the muscles found between the ribs. The ribs are pulled upwards and outwards, so they sort of kind of become, they increase the space in the chest cavity. The diaphragm contracts and moves downwards. That dome-shaped sheet of muscle sort of contracts down the way. It doesn't become completely flat, but it still increases the area in the chest cavity. So that increases the capacity of the thorax, that chest cavity, and reduces air pressure inside the lungs. That then causes air to move from outside into the lungs to sort of equalize the pressure. So air is drawn into the lungs. So it's because whenever we sort of increase or decrease space, we want to sort of equalize that pressure from either outside and inside. So if I was to go back to the whiteboard and just sort of show you what I'm talking about here. So say this is just as we are inhalation, so we're breathing in. And so we're making, imagine this is the chest cavity, we're making the chest cavity bigger, and then so these are our little whatever oxygen molecules, gas molecules, carbon dioxide are in the lungs. So we're making the chest cavity bigger, which decreases the pressure. So we're decreasing the pressure. So air naturally wants to move from outside and inside the lungs. Whereas when we exhale, we are increasing the pressure. So we're making the chest cavity smaller, we're decreasing the space, and so air naturally wants to move from high pressure to low pressure. So it wants to move back outside into the atmosphere. So we're increasing the pressure when we exhale, and air wants to sort of move outside to equalize the pressure in the atmosphere, and vice versa for inhalation. So let's just go back to where we were. So that was inhalation, inspiration. When we breathe out or exhalation, we are relaxing those external intercostal muscles, the muscles between the ribs, and the internal intercostal muscles contract. So we've got external intercostal muscles outside the ribs and internal intercostal muscles inside the ribs. So the diaphragm relaxes and moves upwards, returning to its dome shape. So when it's relaxed, it looks like that dome-shaped sheet of muscle. It decreases the pressure in the chest cavity. The ribs are forced downwards and inwards, and the thoracic cavity becomes smaller. So air pressure inside the lungs increases, and this causes air to be squeezed out of the lungs back into the atmosphere to equalise the pressure. So here we've got our mechanisms of breathing side by side. On the left-hand side, we've got breathing in. So we breathe in air from the atmosphere, and then basically our ribs move sort of up and out and sort of increase the space, the area inside the chest cavity, but that decreases the pressure. The diaphragm, this sheet of muscle here, is still dome-shaped. It's never completely flat, but it moves downwards and contracts again, increasing the chest cavity and decreasing the pressure. When we breathe out, the diaphragm relaxes. It sort of rises back into that dome shape. The ribs sort of move down and in, decreasing the area in the chest cavity and increasing the pressure, and air naturally wants to move out of the lungs into the atmosphere to equalise the pressure. And here's just that summary again. We inhale, the intercostal muscles contract, the ribs move up and out, and then we're increasing the space in the chest cavity, the lungs are inflated, and the diaphragm contracts and moves downwards. When we exhale, the opposite happens, the ribs move downwards and inwards. The diaphragm sort of relaxes back into its dome shape, and the chest cavity, the area decreases and air moves out. So now we want to look at the actual alveoli themselves. So as alveoli, if we're talking about one, and sorry, if we're talking about more than one, if we're talking about a big bunch of alveoli, and alveolus, LUS, if we're talking about one. So these are those like grape-like air-filled sacs, grape-like structures or balloon-filled sacs, whatever you want to think about it, but they're basically filled with air. They're inflated tiny little balloons that look like bunches of grapes right down at the very terminal bronchioles. So they're surrounded by this rich network of blood capillaries. So the alveoli themselves, they're made up of these squamous epithelial tissue. So there's different types of epithelial tissue in the body. We looked at the columnar epithelial cells. This is a sort of more scale-like squamous epithelial tissue. They're kind of like flattened little, like kind of like scales, if you imagine. They're basically one cell thick. So The squamous epithelial tissue are 1 cell thick. Why would we want the alveoli to have such a thin layer? It's because the gas is moving by diffusion, and diffusion is that type of transport which doesn't require energy. So the only transport that I mentioned earlier that required energy was active transport. It's active, it requires energy in the form of ATP, whereas osmosis and diffusion, osmosis, the movement of water molecules, and diffusion, the movement of all other molecules, that is a passive process, not active. It doesn't require energy, and it occurs naturally wherever there's a difference in concentration that exists between two areas. So if there's a difference in concentration, it's obviously going to be easier for those molecules to move if the membrane area between those two areas is really thin, as if there's a thin barrier. So the squamous epithelial tissue is only 1 cell thick, and the capillaries that surround the alveoli, they themselves are only 1 cell thick. So there's a really thin membrane layer which makes diffusion happen so much faster. So the gas exchange is much more rapid than if we had layer upon layer upon layer of cell. It would take ages for diffusion to occur. So there's a reason that the epithelial tissues that make up the alveoli are so thin, and there's a reason why the capillaries have a really thin 1 cell thick membrane as well. It's to allow diffusion and gas exchange to occur much more rapidly. So this is meant to be looking inside the alveoli. So we have the squamous epithelial cells. You see they're kind of like scales. There's not any spaces between them. This is 1 cell here, another cell. There's the nuclei of each of the cells, the wee shaded dark area. So they're 1 cell thick, these squamous epithelial cells. We also have, the squamous epithelial cells usually get referred to as type 1 cells, and then we also have surfactant secreting cells, which sometimes are referred to as type 2 cells. So these cells, there's less of them, but they actually help secrete alveolar surfactant, so like a fluid which helps reduce surface tension and keep the alveoli inflated. You'll also find within the alveoli alveolar macrophages. Now, a macrophage is a type of white blood cell which sort of phagocytoses and destroys and eats up any dirt or debris or microbes or bacteria or anything that might have actually gained entry into the lungs. So these macrophages will mop up and degrade and destroy anything that did manage to get into the lungs, because remember, the lungs are a closed system. Once things are in there, it's not good. It's got nowhere to go. So we have the macrophages as a form of protection to sort of mop up and destroy any debris and things that we might have breathed in. So here over to the right, the pink area, this is the alveolus. So one alveolus. It's got a high concentration of oxygen inside the alveolus, because think about it, if we breathe in oxygen from the atmosphere, so we breathe in oxygen, it travels down our nasal passages, down our pharynx, our larynx, down the trachea, down the bronchi, into the bronchioles, and right down into the alveoli. We have a high concentration of oxygen inside the alveoli of our lungs. So oxygen will naturally want to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So it's high in the lungs, in the alveoli of the lungs. So oxygen will naturally move where there's a lower concentration, which is in the capillaries surrounding the alveoli. And the capillaries surrounding the alveoli have a high concentration of carbon dioxide. Why? Because they're carrying the waste product from cellular respiration. So carbon dioxide will build up as a result of cellular respiration inside the cells, and it has to be removed. So there's a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the capillaries surrounding the lungs. So carbon dioxide will naturally want to move from a high concentration inside the blood capillaries to a low concentration in the alveoli of the lungs, and then it will naturally be breathed out into the atmosphere when we exhale. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are moving in opposite directions. The alveolar fluid, that alveolar surfactant made by those type 2 cells, is composed of phospholipids, and its main functions are to allow the gases to dissolve, because obviously things need to be moist and dissolved, and it makes things easier to travel. So the molecules, the gas molecules, when dissolved, are easier to travel throughout the system. And like I said, they also reduce surface tension and keep the alveoli inflated and prevent the lungs from collapsing. So there's some features of alveoli that make them really, really efficient for their job. So we have millions of alveoli in each of our lungs. It's about 300 million alveoli in each lung. Some textbooks will say, yeah, the 600 to even up to 700 million in both our lungs. So they provide a large surface area for that gas exchange to occur. Each alveolus is surrounded by a rich network of blood capillaries to help maintain the concentration gradient. So the concentration gradient, remember, is the difference that exists between two areas, the difference in concentration, where molecules will naturally move from an area of high concentration to low concentration down a concentration gradient, because molecules always want to equalize, or they want to reach equilibrium. The alveolar capillary membrane is thin. That is basically the membrane between the alveoli themselves, which are 1 cell thick, and the capillaries that are surrounding them. So the membranes have to be thin. Like I said, if there was too many membranes, if there was layer upon layer upon layer of membranes making up the walls of the alveoli and the capillaries, then diffusion would take forever to occur. The membrane needs to be thin to allow gas exchange to happen at a rapid rate. And the alveoli contain that surfactant, that alveolar fluid, which allows the gases to dissolve and reduces surface tension, keeping those little air sacs open. So here's just a summary of everything we've already spoke about. So this is one alveolus here. And then this part here is a capillary, one capillary surrounded there. So these little disc-looking cells are supposed to represent the red blood cells, and then we've got the alveoli here. So if we breathe in air from the atmosphere, we're taking in oxygen from the atmosphere all the way down our respiratory tract to the bottom where we find the alveoli. So the concentration of oxygen inside the alveoli will be really, really high, and it will naturally want to move across the membrane, the alveolar capillary membrane, to the blood capillaries surrounding the alveoli, because they have a lower concentration of oxygen. So oxygen will naturally move from an area of high concentration inside the alveoli to an area of low concentration in the blood capillaries. Whereas carbon dioxide will move in the opposite direction. The carbon dioxide concentration will be high inside the blood capillaries due to cellular respiration and the buildup of carbon dioxide, and then it will naturally want to move to an area of low concentration, which is inside the alveoli of the lungs. So the carbon dioxide will move from the blood capillaries across the alveolar capillary membrane into the alveoli, where it will travel sort of backwards, back the way from where oxygen's just came, all the way up the bronchioles, bronchi, trachea, larynx, pharynx, and out through our nose or our mouth when we breathe it out into the atmosphere. So all of this diffusion happens due to these concentration gradients, because of the difference in concentration that exists between the oxygen and the carbon dioxide between the alveoli and the blood capillaries surrounding them. And here we have just this summarized again. So this is our alveoli here, where we've got this blue is meant to represent the surfactant of the alveoli, that fluid layer helping reduce surface tension. Oxygen is naturally going to move across that alveolar capillary membrane into the capillaries surrounding it, because there's a higher concentration when we breathe in that oxygen from the air, and carbon dioxide will naturally want to move in the opposite direction from the blood capillaries into the alveoli to be breathed out. So let me just undo that. So hopefully that has summarized everything about the respiratory system. So obviously this is taking place all the time and we're not really thinking about it, but we are constantly breathing in oxygen from the atmosphere and getting rid of our waste product, carbon dioxide. So all of our systems work interdependently together. So the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system, you can imagine, work hand in hand together because the cardiovascular system is responsible for transporting those red blood cells which contain hemoglobin, which pick up that oxygen and transport it all around our body cells and tissues. So never think of one system as working alone. It's always working interdependently with all the other systems. So that's the respiratory system, and I hope that was helpful.